Derrick, is COVID over?
That's a good question. I guess that depends on how you define COVID. I tend to use the term COVID 1984, and that is sort of like a catch-all term related to not just the alleged pandemic, but all of the bigger implications that came afterwards: the growth of the surveillance state, the growth of the police state, advancing of agendas like digital IDs and all the general stuff, facial recognition, all the things that we saw expanding over the last 5 years. I don't think that's over for sure. Whether or not the claims of another pandemic, which every now and then, of course, we see that in the headlines, something popping up, and I think there's somebody trying to test the waters to see, will they still buy it? Will they, and most people just kind of shrug their shoulders these days and like, what? They're claiming there's a new variant or something going around. But as far as, the bigger implications and the advancing of the technocratic agenda, that has definitely not gone away.
The term COVID is a catch-all phrase, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that there were advantages of the pre-COVID world in some ways. The steps before everything I just mentioned, the advancement of the technocratic surveillance state and facial recognition and digital IDs and everything that we're still seeing play out. And at the same time, I kind of feel like COVID was also a gift in some ways, as far as that, as crazy as that might sound, because in my view, a lot of people woke up because of this whole operation, right? There are people who 2019, 2020 were basically just normies, just regular people going about their lives. And then, the whole panic happened and then the authoritarianism happened. And that caused them, something about those events caused them to start questioning things and find podcasts like yours or mine and others and begin their journey. So in that way, I feel like, okay, the world is better now post-COVID 1984. And at the same time, what I've noticed is that as things kind of started to calm down or go back to normal, a lot of people who were concerned about things sort of also went back to their normal lives. And just briefly, I'll explain what I mean there is that, I saw a huge influx of people, not only through my audience, but some of the networks that I'm a part of. I mentioned I host the People's Reset every year in Mexico, and that was very much a response to the Great Reset and the Davos crowd hosting their event every January. So we said, well, look, why don't we get together every January for 5 days and talk about solutions, from a bottom-up perspective instead of this kind of technocratic top-down perspective. And I think movements like that and others that were heavily solutions focused saw a big spike of interest in people during the COVID years. And we're still doing our thing. We have another event coming up in January, but I definitely have noticed a lull, like where it just was this big spike of people, so much energy. And it's because people felt threatened and they were in panic mode. So they're like, what am I going to do? How am I going to take care of myself? Maybe I need to, get off big tech or grow my own food, or I need to get my kids out of school, or whatever it was, whatever their solutions were. And then as time went on and life seemed to go back to normal, a lot of those people were like, okay, well, I don't need to worry about that anymore. Things are, everything's okay now. So in that way, I kind of, I think it was a double-edged sword. We had some new people waking up and questioning the world around them. But unfortunately, because things seem to have kind of calmed down, a lot of those people have maybe gone back to sleep.
Yes, I've noticed that too. It's almost as though lockdowns didn't happen.
Yeah, people have short-term memories, it seems like. And I've battled this myself personally, because I wish that as a species that we weren't that way, where it didn't take for us to feel threatened, directly, because that's typically how most of us act. And I think maybe it's a benefit, but also a flaw to human thinking. Like, you can see that there's bad things going on in the world, but until it directly impacts you and your family or your daily routine and, the things that you hold dear to yourself, most of us will kind of say, well, that's crazy, but, I got to take care of my own. And that's a positive thing in the sense of us taking care of our families and just trying to create our own beautiful lives. But also when we turn our backs or we try to ignore the bigger pictures of the things going on in the world and throughout history, I think we both know, and probably everybody in this audience knows, that those things can come back to, they end up knocking on your front doorstep eventually.
But it doesn't make sense to me, Derrick, how it is possible that, let's say, you and I are part of this very small group of people that saw through everything.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on that one as well. Even before COVID, I would ask myself this over the years of like, because I was an average kid growing up. I was drinking sodas and drinking fluoride water and watching a lot of TV, and I'm sure I was consuming propaganda through the TV shows that I was watching and didn't even realize it. But eventually I found my way, and kind of for me, it was like a major life shift. Like I went to prison at 20 years old, 20 years ago, actually this year. And that kind of caused me to shift and change everything that I was doing. And then through that eventually led me to questioning government and learning about conspiracies and these sorts of things. And I've heard from other people too, where they have like something direct or personally impact them. Like maybe they or a loved one gets sick with cancer or something, and then that causes them to go down the rabbit hole of learning the truth about cancer and in health in general. Or a lot of people, it was the 2008 financial crisis. And hold on a second. Sorry about it. A lot of people, it was the 2008 financial crisis or something similar, like in a big way that directly impacted them. So then their entire lives changed. I think that is an important element. And then there might also be some other psychological, there definitely are some other psychological elements, because you could you could put somebody like us in a situation like that, and maybe it causes us to dig deeper and question the world around us. And you can put another person in the exact same situations, and they may never choose to ask questions. I've wondered if it's just like, is there something genetically? Is there something that, some of us are just born predisposed to wake up and to question things? I tend to believe, or I want to believe, I hope that all of humanity is capable of this, and that's why I still do strive. Like I said, even though I mainly focus on journalism these days, I still do see myself as an activist, and I still feel like part of my activism is a conscious and direct effort to quote unquote, wake people up, and as silly as that might sound, I think some people maybe don't even bother doing that anymore in the age we're in. I still think it's important. I still feel like there's not enough people. We need to still pull people out of the matrix and then say, hey, now here's the better thing we're trying to build. Now that you're questioning the world, here's what comes next. And I want to believe that all of humanity is capable of that. But sometimes I look around and I see signs that maybe that's not true.
When did you have your first Damascus moment, your first red pill, so to speak?
Yeah, so in 2003, when the U.S. started bombing Iraq, I was 18 years old. I was just graduating high school. And for the first, I remember watching it on TV. They showed it all over the U.S. And I remember watching it on TV. And for the first couple of days or weeks or so, as just a young 18-year-old kid who didn't really know anything, I was definitely watching that, like, wow, we're getting a bad guy. They're bombing this bad dude, and kind of buying into some of the propaganda that was very rampant in the post 9/11 world. And I'd always been like, I grew up in the punk scene and as a metalhead. So I was generally like, yeah, fuck the government, kind of anti-authority, but not with any sort of deep understanding, just kind of like a rebel without a cause type thing. So then with some time, especially as the anti-war marches started, I definitely very much that was, I think, one of the first light bulbs where I was like, all right, something's not right. So at 18, I'm in a lot of bands and we were like singing anti-Bush songs. And, I used to have this like giant full-size cardboard cutout of George Bush, and we'd bring it on stage and like rip his head off and throw it to the crowd, stuff like that, right? But then at the same time, the next year, I went and voted for John Kerry. I voted for the Democrats. That was the only time I've ever voted in my life as a young 18-year-old kid who didn't really know much of anything. So I feel like that was the beginning, but it was still like within the left-right paradigm, right? I'm starting to question things, but I'm still kind of going back and forth. And then it wasn't until a few years later, as I said, when I got locked up, and then I ended up doing 18 months in Texas state prisons. When I got out in late 2008, that was right as Obama was getting elected. I wasn't very politically aware at all or anything like that. But within the next year, I started to really pay more attention. And I will say people who I don't trust anymore, like Alex Jones, definitely played a role in my early years. I watched Endgame. I read Jim Marrs, a researcher. He's now deceased. His book, Rule by Secrecy. I was listening to another metal band that was like literally singing about the Federal Reserve. And then I did read former Congressman Ron Paul's book in the U.S. and then heard him speak. And it was all those things happened within like a week span of time, like watching Endgame, reading this book, hearing Ron Paul speak. And like I said, I don't really trust Jones these days. And, I'm not really one for politics. But all of those things came together at that time where my young mind, getting fresh out of prison and also having the experience of being a felon, like the combination of those things, I think just put me in a state of mind where I was very ready and willing to question the world around me. And then from that, I mean, it was pretty much, that was it. Like once those things happened, I tumbled down that rabbit hole, and it's been going on 16 years now since then.
I also come from a punk rock background. I don't know if you can read that.
I see that. Nice. I'm with it.
That's a great thing. The punk rock scene was really, really good in so many ways, but I noticed that they all kind of followed the establishment during the COVID era. Did you notice?
Oh yeah. Yeah, man. That, actually I have this like short essay I've been working on my mind about this, because I have a particular bone to pick with the punk community, having sort of been, raised almost within that community. And there is a lot of true community and camaraderie. I'm sure you've experienced that as well, where you do feel like, okay, we're a part of something bigger. And then over time, especially as I started to wake up, even before COVID, but especially during COVID, I started to realize that when I was thinking I wanted to get out of the norm and kind of, I've always been against conformity and just like, I want to be myself, think for myself. And that's what it appears like a lot of punk is. And so, dress a certain way, who cares what society thinks, this sort of thing. But then even that over years, I started to realize like, okay, there's a certain costume even within this scene of people. Like if I'm not dressed exactly like that punk look, then some people don't think I'm a punk. Or if I'm not listening to these particular bands, then I'm not the right kind of punk. Or, just this sort of same cliquishness you see everywhere, unfortunately. And yeah, over the years, as I got further into my activism and I've watched a lot of my old punk friends, I'm like, okay, so they don't really care too much. They just want to get drunk and, drink 40s and go to the shows and party and do that. And that is rebelling to them. That's like being against the system. But if I was to talk to them about any legitimate issue, the vast majority of them wouldn't really have an informed opinion. And if they did have an informed opinion, as you said, it would probably be a very much an establishment opinion, even if they thought it was anti-establishment. And I definitely saw that during COVID. I will say that not the only one, but one of the major punk bands that I saw and that actually I'm connected with is Total Chaos. Rob Chaos, the lead singer of that band, they've been around since the 90s. I actually interviewed him in the middle of COVID, and he talked about how much they were sort of like, blackballed for still wanting to play shows and for not taking the COVID shots and for speaking out against some of the lockdowns. He just said how there is definitely a lot of bands that we probably grew up listening to, even the ones that didn't speak out vocally, but who behind closed doors were shaming other punk bands who were not buying into the narrative and like not wearing masks or not pushing, their crowd to get the injections and stuff like that. And yeah, of course, that was just like, wow, you guys really didn't get your own message, did you?
Dude, The Offspring, what a disappointment.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. So many others, right?
But it wasn't just the music industry. I mean, it was just everybody. The whole thing just imploded. And it goes to show how powerful the propaganda messaging was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's, I think, I try to be empathetic, I think, for people who did fall for COVID. I mean, at this point, I feel like you're either just not wanting to know and not willing to look. But in the height of everything, with the panic and the 24/7 news cycle and all the stuff going on, I try to be empathetic with people to understand that we are facing, in a lot of ways, one of the biggest propaganda machines that history has ever seen, and that can be difficult to overcome. And we all, of course, understand things like cognitive dissonance, where our own brains sometimes will fight or resist, new information and conclusions that might feel just too grand. Because if I accept that conclusion, if I accept that the government is lying to me about this alleged pandemic, then that means I have to also start questioning other pieces of my paradigm. And for some people, they'd rather not do that. But yeah, I try to remember that as much as it can be frustrating. And like I said earlier, I still do have this desire to want to reach people and help them on their journey. Ultimately, everybody's got to walk their own path. Everybody's got to make their own choices. And all we can really do is plant seeds and then, of course, produce content like this to try to give people avenues to start questioning the world around them. And the rest is up to them. I mean, and back to what we were talking about earlier, I don't know, maybe some people aren't, in some grander scheme of things that we don't quite understand. Maybe some people aren't meant to wake up and some are. Doesn't mean we are better than anybody or anything like that. Maybe that's just not their path. But I still strive to reach as many people as possible in the hopes that they might wake up.
You dropped into your conversation earlier about the the fake binaries, the false dichotomy of left, right, liberal, conservative, etc. And people are very much still stuck in that. Trump has done an incredible job at pulling people back into the system.
100%. I do believe that this is the role that Trump was brought into play since the very beginning, from 2015. I think I wrote an article in 2016 called The Establishment's Plan to Divide Donald Trump, Fake News in Russia, and sort of just calling some of these things, because to me it was kind of obvious that this guy was kind of brought in to be a wrecking house, right? Like a wrecking crew. Everybody, people who were sick of Obama and sick of the Bush years and all that, well, this guy doesn't care. He's calling out the media. He's saying something here and there about 9/11, or he mentioned the Federal Reserve. It's like he threw just enough like pieces of the puzzle out there to entice certain people. Oh, he mentioned 9/11, and so he got like the 9/11 truthers. Maybe he's going to, reveal the truth at the Federal Reserve crowd. Maybe he's going to talk about that and end the Fed. And he mentioned JFK.
Epstein.
He mentioned Epstein, all these different pieces of the puzzle. So and when you really look at what he says, he never really said anything substantial, but just enough to kind of string people along and keep them, maybe he's going to do it. Maybe he's going to do it. But I always felt like his role was to be, this is kind of how these people operate too, like symbolically. Like I don't think his last name is a mistake. I think that he is their trump card. He is like the final card that they're playing to divide, not only to divide the masses, like the average person, which he is really great at, stoking those fires and stoking those flames and creating separation, but then even within the broader freedom, truth, conspiracy, realism community. As well as I do that there's a lot of people who now look back on the last 10 years that Trump has been around, and in their eyes, he is the savior who came here and has been trying to fight the deep state, but they just keep stifling him at every turn. And, he's just almost there. And if we could just all get behind him, we could, finally defeat the New World Order. That is the version of events that some people believe in. And that really does disturb me and scare me to think like just how the psychological operations have gotten so good that we're now living in different fracture. I tend to call this the fracturing, where humanity, not only like those of us who are awake and those who are asleep, that's one element, but then even within this sort of community that a broader community we're in, like the fracturing is this idea that the psychological operations, the fifth generation warfare is getting so big that we are existing in essentially parallel realities. Sure, we're in the same physical meat space, but these people, like I said, some of them look back and they have a whole QAnon interpretation of the last 10 years, and they think Trump is the greatest thing ever. And just how that split the conspiracy community. This isn't going to be a temporary thing. Like I think in 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to look back and there are going to be people like us who are like, oh my God, they fooled people with Trump and this and that. And there's going to be others who, however it turns out, they're going to see that Trump was like the great hero that tried to defeat the deep state. And so that to me is really disturbing, just to see how our realities can become fractured like that. And to your point about the digital IDs and things of that sort. Yeah, even right now, as we're recording this, in the U.S., they're discussing this giant bill, and I won't call it by Trump's name because I just hate the moronic names he gives to everything. But it's this giant bill that they're trying to stuff as many things in, and he's promising it's going to be the greatest thing ever, right? But if you look further into it,
Stargate.
I'm actually working. Yeah, Stargate. Obviously, we had Stargate was the first announcement. I'm working on an article about this giant bill right now to show all the different. I'm calling it the Big Brother bill. He has another name for it, but to me, it's more accurately the Big Brother bill because a big chunk of it does absolutely increase facial recognition. They want to install towers along the border. And I've been warning people that the fight against illegal immigration was going to be used to bring in, the post-COVID 1984 totalitarian digital ID facial recognition state. And of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't real concerns about immigration or anything like that. But this is what I think some people can't grasp, is that what I often call the predator class, the folks at the top of the pyramid of power, that they operate like they'll give us two bad decisions and then try to force us to make one of them, and either way they win. So in one hand you have people who are like, we need to just have open borders, or just we need to not try to stop anybody from coming into any countries, whether that's Europe or the United States. I think we've all seen that weaponized immigration is real and it can end up being a bad thing. I generally I lean more towards like getting the government out of the way, but I can also see how that's been weaponized, right? So doing nothing or continuing with the Biden policies in the U.S. isn't an answer. And then at the same time, giving Trump and his administration the ability to just full on grab people off the streets without really much due process, masked agents who aren't even identifying themselves, installing facial recognition cameras everywhere, putting towers along the border, doing what Trump has called for and what this bill includes, a biometric entry and exit system for everybody, not just for immigrants. That's what a lot of people don't understand. You know, they're fighting for this because they think it's going to solve the immigration issue, but they don't see how it's actually going to work against them. And of course, you know, when you put it in the context of things like Stargate, and as I've written quite extensively, the numerous Peter Thiel acolytes and Palantir acolytes that are also in Trump's second administration, it's clear to me, and I think it should be clear as day to anybody who's actually wanting to look and doesn't have, you know, an authority bias or a trust of authority, that this is going, you know, that this is a classic problem reaction solution. You know, so like, again, if we do nothing and we just allow the borders to be wide open, there's going to be problems with that. But if you accept the solution that they're proposing, there's going to be problems with that. And that's kind of, I think, what we often end up faced in. But since people can't see that, they're like, well, they feel like they need to choose one or the other. And it's not like we're really being given a choice. It's going to happen, I think, one way or the other. But to make it even matters even worse, they've got the Trump crowd cheering it, not just kind of accepting like, okay, we're going this direction, but cheering it and believing that it's actually a solution. And people who used to talk about this, including Alex Jones, who, as I said, played a role in waking me up, now are completely silent about the role that the Bilderbergers are playing in Trump's second administration, are now trying to downplay the role of Peter Thiel and Palantir and things like this and just act like it's not a big deal. People are just freaking out. You know, there's nothing to see here. It's pretty crazy, man. It's a pretty weird space to find ourselves in, but it's honestly not that surprising because I've always felt like things were going to get worse before they got better. Things were going to progress, and that people who and I'm sure it's going to happen even more than just where we are sitting today, that people who we believed had principles and actually, you know, believed in individual liberty or the U.S. Constitution in the case of the U.S. are willing to just toss that out if it means following their favorite personality. And that's really unfortunate.
But Derrick, please, come on, trust the plan. It's 5D chess.
I know. I'm just not keeping up enough with all the Q drops and all the deltas out there and the confirmation. I'm trying to keep up my best, but I have a little bit of a problem with trusting the plan, and maybe I just need some re-education.
I love what you were saying earlier about solutions. You're very solution driven. Now, this is something that I have found. The average person is not actually interested in solutions. They are fascinated by doom scrolling. That's all they want. They just want to share on
Absolutely.
WhatsApp and Telegram how bad everything is.
Man, this is an issue I've seen since the beginning of my work, and it sounds like you've come across it too. I would do videos years ago, and I still do from time to time, but so I'd have like, my Jeffrey Epstein documentary, just as an example. I put that out in 2018. I started investigating Epstein in 2016. I went to his house in 2017. A lot of those videos, 500,000 plus views, almost 1 million views on one of them here and there, right? And then I do a video about like, here's how to grow your own food. You can produce, 500 pounds of food in an acre or whatever, something like that. And crickets. I get like 1/10 or less of the views on a video like that. And that still happens today, even as my audience has grown. And I think as more and more my audience or people who find my work are understanding that I try to focus on solutions, I still do notice that if my weekly news reports about the crazy shit going on in the world is going to get more eyes and attention on it than my video of like, here's the steps to take to free yourself from the system, because, well, that takes effort. That takes time. That might actually take, changing your habits or changing your lifestyle or, changing your bank if you want to stop supporting the banking system. Different things that I promote are not go vote. They're not, trust the politician. And they're definitely not just give up and be black-pilled and negative, despite the fact that people like myself, and I'm sure you as well, have been called such things for not supporting politicians, especially during the 2024 election. But it's really unfortunate, man. I see the same thing and I unfortunately, I agree with you that I think most people are addicted to doom scrolling and would probably rather just obsess over how bad the world is than do something about it. And maybe that we're battling human nature on that front. I do think some of it is the programming and the sort of learned helplessness that a lot of us have bought into, where people just, They don't think they can do anything for themselves. And also the systems that we're born into, I think, like if you're born into a system that is telling you just, get the biggest house, get the newest cars, get the latest phone, download the newest apps, and just kind of chasing that so-called, American dream, at least as they call it in the US, which a lot of countries have tried to model themselves after, unfortunately. When you're kind of in that space, it doesn't feel like there's time to do anything else. Like, right. Even so, I use my family as an example. My sister and her husband, for example, they're very working class people. My family's not wealthy by any means, but they've got a nice little house for them and their 3 kids. And they're, my sister's a stay-at-home mom. Her husband is working 5 days a week, and then the weekend comes and they just want to hang out with the kids or hang out with some friends and drink a couple beers. And they're good people. They know about my work. My sister's husband, every time I see him, I just saw him last week, he asked me questions like, hey, what do you think about this thing? What do you think about this? He's asking me about Iran last time I saw him. And he's what I would consider fairly awake. He knows what's going on. He follows my work. He sees what's happening. But he's not doing a single thing about it. He's not doing anything about it. He's just watching it get worse. He's just going through the motions. And like I said earlier, just trying to take care of home base. I just got to feed the kids. I got to take care of my wife. I got to do that. And if I can do that, then maybe I can get to the weekend and have a few beers and just relax a little bit, right? And it's like you're stuck in that rat race of just trying to keep up. And so the idea of him of going to protest or talk to somebody, even doing that, let alone changing his life to try to grow food or, getting off big tech and different things that I promote with my exit and build strategy. That's just like, that's not even in his wheelhouse. That's not even his mind. That's like the last thing he's thinking about, right? And I feel like there's a lot of people who are like that. They generally understand there's something wrong in the world. They might not be fully aware to the levels that you and I are and people in this audience, but they know things aren't right, but they're also not doing anything about it. And so they're kind of like this, I think that's like the real silent majority, the people out there who know things are wrong, but do nothing about it. And unfortunately, that's not enough. It's not enough. And I've been saying this for a few years. It's not enough to be awake anymore, if it ever was, or conscious or aware, whatever words you want to use. I tend to go with the term activated, because activated kind of distinguishes from just being awake, because you can be awake and you can be passive. You can be awake and be doom scrolling, right? You can be awake and walk right into the FEMA camp because you never did anything about it, because you never prepared, because you never took any alternative steps or tried to resist the machine. You just watched it on your phone as the world got worse and worse. And surprise, surprise, here it is, right? So I do think there's a difference between being awake, aware, and then activated, like actively trying to work on solutions. And I've got my ideas, but whatever solutions appeal to people. Personally, I don't think politics is the way. But if you feel inclined to politics, then go super local, run for your school board or town council or something like that. Try to impact your local area. But whatever you're doing, do something, because I think the vast majority are doing nothing, even if they see themselves as awake and aware. And they might even be the kind of people that, look at those stupid sheeple out there. They're so asleep and I'm so awake. But at the end of the day, are you doing anything with that knowledge? Because if not, you might as well be one of the sheep then, because what difference does it make? Both of you are going to end up the same place if you don't take any concrete steps to make sure that you can be free in the face of this coming technocratic state.
You mentioned FEMA camps, and that's another one. But Trump brought in warp speed to stop the FEMA camps.
You've heard that one too, huh? I've met a few of the people pushing that. Isn't there like a documentary that really tried to push that? Like what is that? I don't even remember the guy's name, and I'm not trying to badmouth anybody, but somebody sent it to me, and it's like I don't even want to call it a documentary because I think it discredits that word. It was just a strewn together bunch of clips, and one of them had to do with this guy who I see on Twitter every now and then who made a painting and it had Q in it, and he's like, look, Trump shared this Q painting, so that's a proof of something, and warp speed was to prevent us from going to FEMA camps so we can all celebrate. Yeah, man, I mean, I don't even know what world these people are living in, and it's unfortunate. I will say that I've had some success since 2016 when I first started taking time to debunk a lot of the Q claims and just all the weird stuff going on, because I do think it is a psychological operation. I do think people in Trump's team know about it, but they're playing people. They're not actually doing the things they're claiming, but they're playing his base. But I've had some success, thankfully, and I've gotten some emails and some comments from people who's saying, hey, you helped me kind of snap out of the Q thing. I was going down that rabbit hole, and now I see I was being played, and I can't believe I fell for it. So sometimes I can be pretty harsh to that crowd because I think sometimes a tough love is the way, especially when you're that deep down the rabbit hole. Because as I'm sure you've seen the same responses I've seen, no matter what bit of evidence you actually try to provide to somebody like that, there's just, they have like, it's like the psychological operation built in all the cognitive dissonance for them. So, they save Israel for last, trust the plan, get your popcorn, all these kind of things, right? Like they just think that you're the ones who don't know what's going on. You're just not informed enough to know what's happening. But it really is a sad state of affairs, man. And I think it's a testament to the power of whatever you want to call it, the New World Order, to this psychological operation, to this long-term generational planning that we know has been going on. And now it's at the point where the internet, social media is part of the battlefield. Our minds are part of the battlefield. And they sure do know a lot about us. They have definitely created profiles, psychological profiles. I've actually been looking back at the Cambridge Analytica links and just remembering, I encourage people to go back and look at what that was, because when you really understand that this company, which just scraped all this Facebook data and then was selling it to, and probably still is selling it to, or other companies doing the same thing, selling it to politicians and saying, hey, I can give you all the data you need on how to speak to the voters. And on one hand, it's like, cool, that's great for marketing, right? But when you really understand it, that it's a psychological profile, they even called it psychographics, where, they had this ability to tailor their messaging to exactly what people want to hear. And I believe that working with Cambridge Analytica and other companies, and of course the intelligence networks, that they are able to create the exact stimuli and get the exact response that they want. They know if we say this, that is going to trigger this segment of the population, and it's going to excite this segment of the population. And if you say these particular phrases, that's going to get these people listening and trusting, and it might work on 30% of the population, and that's all we need. We don't need the rest of them. We'll just drown out the rest of them with our movement, right? I think it's down to that level at this point, and the QAnon operation is a big part of that, and is trying to just suck people in and get them to support literally their own enslavement all the way to the point that they are walking in the FEMA camps that they think Trump stopped.
Or as Larkin Rose and Andrew Treglia said, the Jones Plantation.
Yeah, it's a great film.
Speaking of technocracy, Elon Musk is a wonderful example of this. I mean, he is a technocrat and he's very likable, and he's a bit of a buffoon at times. I mean, he clowns around. I don't know what he actually does during the day. And as Catherine Fitz says, he's actually just an operation.
Yeah. And I think that what you pointed to, like his sort of buffoonery, his likability to a certain crowd of people, he's just one of us, playing video games, posting memes, all of that, again, I think is a profile that was created for him. Maybe certain elements are truly who he is, but they're definitely capitalized upon in order to appeal to a certain crowd of people. The crowd of people who like memes, the crowd of people who, like trolling, the crowd of people who are this kind of become a thing where people sort of brag about or like to claim that they're autistic, this sort of thing. And we're just the autists online, like even with the QAnon crowd and stuff. And I definitely think that Elon, whatever role he's playing, is to get that crowd of people to pay attention to. Like, he tweets all day, he plays video games, he shares funny memes, he makes fun of Bill Gates. He's one of us. He's one of the crew, right? He totally gets it, and he's just a tech nerd like all of us. He uses the internet, and that's something that we hadn't seen prior to the last few years. Most of us tend to think, this is changing maybe a little more recently, but most of us tend to think of politicians as being kind of old and out of touch, and so the last place you would expect to see them is on social media, posting memes and joking with other people. And although Elon has kind of straddled that line of being a politician, I think he clearly is now with the Doge and going to the White House and everything. He is an influential person either way. And yeah, I mean, I've struggled with this one as well. Like, I think I wrote an essay in 2017 asking, why are American libertarians falling for Elon Musk? Because at that time it was still early on. It wasn't anywhere near where we are now, but there was a lot of people who were starting to have this cult-like mentality around him, especially because, I'm originally from Texas, so I'm here in Houston right now, and a few hours away is where his gigafactory was built a couple years ago. And I remember when that thing opened up, I mean, it was just hundreds of thousands of people were trying to get to the opening, and all these younger mid-20s dudes, mostly dudes, there's women too as well, but mostly young men in their 20s, early 30s, who are tech savvy, and they're just looking at this guy like a hero. And I also think that the operation has been kind of seated in our minds for a while, going back to the Iron Man movie in 2008, when they had him kind of make a guest appearance, and Tony Stark even being modeled after this, billionaire playboy, cool hip dude with all his gadgets and everything, and Elon kind of trying to bring that archetype to life. So I do think that this has been seated in the minds of a certain crowd of people for over a decade now, to see him as this kind of a hero, and he's the radical guy. Why, and sort of it plays right into Trump's "Make America Great Again," because for some people they're like, well, America used to be this beautiful thing. We were trying to go to space. We were building rockets. We were doing all kinds of revolutionary things. And now we've kind of given that up. But Trump and Elon, they're bringing that back. He's bringing back American greatness and pride and all this sort of stuff, even though he's not even from the U.S. He's, got all these South Africa ties and stuff going on in Canada, of course. But I think that's the sort of personality type they were trying to play to, is like, if you're sick of being told that America is everything bad and we just have this legacy of slavery, and you're sick of all that, well, we're going to be the opposite of that. We're going to be the people who champion America and wave the flags everywhere and talk about how great we are, and unapologetically, and aim for the stars. And there's nothing inherently wrong with those things on their own, but it's all just a facade in order to suck people into technocracy.
Well, that's what I was alluding to. And that's the danger also of technocracy. The average person doesn't quite understand it, because what it does, and it's beautiful in its design, is that it merges, communism and capitalism and all these isms into one system of mass control that uses technology and science and things that sound great.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. I've been trying to champion that message as well for a few years, because there's this dichotomy, the binary that a lot of people get stuck in, not just the left, the right, Democrats, Republicans in the US, but the communism versus fascism element too as well. And I think the reason that is also important to suss out and to expose for people is because Anthony Sutton, who was one of the early researchers who was talking about technocracy, along with Patrick Wood and their book Trilaterals over Washington, and some of the early work that they were doing back in the 70s, talking about the Trilateral Commission and how that was kind of a rebirth of the original technocracy movement from the 1930s. Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, David Rockefeller, and some others helped found the Trilateral Commission. And it was all coming out of Columbia University, which also happens to be the birthplace of technocracy. They were saying back then that too many people were getting sucked into this narrative of, whether it's capitalism or communism, fascism or, extreme leftism, whatever dichotomy, binary you want to put there, that people were still fighting those kind of ghosts, and that really wasn't what it was about. And in fact, I've even heard, the legend researcher G. Edward Griffin say that back in the 50s and 60s, he kind of fell into that. Of course, communism, the Red Scare, he's like, we had good reason to be afraid of communism, and I think there's legit reasons, but he kind of put that up as like, that's the ultimate enemy. And then over time, he realized, wait, that's just another binary that they're putting in front of me, to it's capitalism or it's communism. And like you said, the technocracy merges these different elements together. And so I saw this a lot I think it happens every election, but especially this past year's election in the United States, where people were saying, on one hand, if Biden wins or if Kamala Harris wins, it's going to be full on communism. Like, this is the end of freedom. Freedom of speech is going to die everywhere. We have to stop her at all costs. Right. And then, of course, the other side, who's doesn't like Trump, but maybe not for the reasons we're talking about here, says like, if Trump's going to win, it's going to be full on fascism. And, I don't disagree with them, but it's still setting up in those kind of binaries of it's communism or it's fascism, and not realizing that technocracy is kind of above and beyond both of these and is going to use elements of all of the above, but by focusing on the wrong, not only by giving it the wrong names, then you're kind of missing the bigger picture, you're missing the point. And you can't really fight something if you don't know what it is. If you don't know not only just the name of it, but the ideology, the goals, the mission of the thing you're fighting, then you're going to keep losing because you're fighting the wrong thing.
And I mean, a good example of technocracy in a real world setting is the UN. It's already pushing sustainable development agendas and smart cities and smart grids and smart everything. Meanwhile, like the Trump base, for example, are like, oh, but it's China. They're the enemy, but they're forgetting who the real enemy is.
Yeah, there's this. I mean, I get the concern about China in some instances, but I definitely see that has become, that's like the red herring that a lot of the MAGA media, right wing conservatives, or Iran now, it's like that, or the, whatever the sort of right leaning, even if they consider themselves awake, again, like InfoWars, Alex Jones, it's like it's the Chi-Coms, it's like this sort of narrative that it's just like singularly focused on that, right? And they're missing the bigger picture. And to me, and I'd love your opinion on this, man, because I've been reflecting on this recently, especially with the bombing of Iran and all this stuff going on. Is like, at times I tend to doubt any of these groups are truly against each other. I think that there's probably true cultural differences, right, between the Chinese and the Iranians and the Americans and stuff like that. But what I often tell my audience is that even if they have disagreements, and those disagreements occasionally flare up into the public view, 99 times out of 100, the rulers of these countries and the people who are behind them, the banking class, et cetera, and the others who are actually pulling the strings, they will side with each other 99 times out of 100 over the people. So even if they have real occasional disputes and spats, that doesn't mean that we need to fall into the trap of like, I want to support China because they're going to, or the BRICS nations, they're going to save me from the US, or they're, vice versa. I think that, for me at least, is another kind of trap of starting to identify with one of these other players. But what do you think about that? I mean, do you think that they are all sitting behind the scenes, sharing champagne glasses, or do you think some of the disputes we see in front of the camera are legit?
I think that some of the disputes are legit, but I think more importantly, all wars are bankers' wars. Biden, right? The guy couldn't speak in full sentences, right? So it was clear as day that he wasn't pulling the strings. And I think every person who's sane will agree that he wasn't pulling the strings. So if that is true, what makes you think that Trump is pulling the strings?
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing about that whole Biden thing, to sort of reveal that the president is a puppet, because that's one sort of benefit I saw of the whole thing, is like, okay, well, people are finally seeing like the president is a puppet. But unfortunately, because it was in the guise of an old man who is becoming more and more senile every day, and and honestly, it's like, I don't think Biden's a hero or a good guy, but there's definitely an element of like, man, this is just sad. They're just literally propping this old dude up and making him go around, and just, he's probably confused everywhere he goes. But then because, well, Trump's a little more fit, he's got all his mental faculties and this and that, people all of a sudden forget, okay, but last year, I mean, even in the last 6 months, there have been reporting in the mainstream U.S. press about the different group of people in the Biden White House who are pulling the strings of Biden. Now, of course, even those people, like you say, I think are low level. They're not like the actual people running it. But even if you just take the mainstream perspective, the mainstream media was willing to admit Biden was not in charge. There was about 5 or 6 people around him, including his wife and some other decision makers, who were actually making these major decisions. And even at that level, then that's like, okay, so the mask has kind of come off. The president's not in charge. People around him are the ones that make those decisions. But I think we know at a deeper level, it's not even those bureaucrats. It's people above and beyond them. But still, now that Trump's in office, it's like some of his crowd have forgotten that. And they think, no, that was Biden because Biden's old and senile. Trump's coming in and he's taking charge. He's the one really leading the way now.
That's the thing about the Biden administration. He was so stupid and clumsy and old and senile that it made Trump's ascension so much easier. And then, of course, exactly, the theater of the shooting, and the assassination attempt, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing made him into this hero.
Exactly. That was all like, and I've been trying to, I'm glad that you're on the same page as that, because I think there's even folks within the independent so-called alternative media who are still they question Trump, but they still buy the assassination attempts. And everything about that day does not sit well with me. And I think there's some great reporting out there kind of calling into question the different discrepancies. But overall, that was part of a larger operation to deify Trump. And I mean, we saw that, literally right after the shooting, there's people who claim to be Christians and others, religious folk.
That photo also.
The photo of the hands and all that. I mean, it's just like so perfectly timed, right? And like you said, I think that it had to be done the way it was. Like, you have to show people this guy is not in control in terms of Biden. This guy is just, he's just embarrassing the country. And also the left, the Democrats, the progressives were pushing transgenderism as boldly as you could go. And they're pushing all kinds of policies that, again, the average American, like, to use my family again, I think about my brother-in-law all the time, because he's not a hardcore Trumper, but he's just like, I don't want my daughter getting exposed to this kind of stuff. I don't want her to be, I don't want to support these COVID mandates these people are trying to push. And so what it does is all of a sudden he's looking over at Trump, and Trump's like, I'm going to be better than the other side. He literally doesn't have to try hard. He's just like, I'm going to do better than them. We're going to get rid of all the bad things that you hate. And then, of course, the shooting, and then Musk and Zuckerberg and everybody rallying around him and like, oh, he's such a badass and this and that. Like, it was quite an operation. And I think that all of that had to happen in order for it to be successful. You have to make the other side look as dumb and stupid and irresponsible as possible, pushing policies that any sane person would not support, and then just present somebody who seems to be slightly better. It's like all he had to do was just be slightly less of a piece of a shit as the other side. And it was enough for a lot of people. And even though in my mind, all of the signs were there, I did a 2-hour conversation with Ian Carroll, who has just blown up a lot in the last year and who I'm very skeptical of, despite us having some conversations. I don't really fully trust him, but we did a 2-hour conversation prior to the election, and I was laying out all these things and, getting called black-pilled, getting called negative, getting called doomer, whatever, for pointing out the obvious signs of what we're now seeing. Like 6 months into Trump's administration, and here we are. Today's July 1st, right? So we've got 6 months of data now to look at, and I think those of us who were calling out Trump and concerned about the presence of Bilderberg members around him and what WF members around him and technocrats and Zionists, etc., have been proven correct. And we are only 1/8 of the way through this thing.
What's the moral of the story then?
Don't trust politicians. Don't trust politicians. I mean, I don't think there's I don't see how any, I don't know. I don't want to be demeaning. I don't want to be demoralizing to people. Do what you think works best for you. But I don't see how an informed, educated adult, I'm only 40 years old. I don't claim to be an expert or, the most educated person on the planet, but I don't see how people can continue to watch what we're witnessing, not just in the United States, but I know the same patterns repeated elsewhere in the UK and Canada and South Africa and across Europe, where people keep falling for the next person that's promising to come along and fix this situation. And I guarantee you there will be another one. There's, whether it's going to be J.D. Vance in a couple of years or even I see people like Thomas Massie in the U.S. He's a great guy in terms of principle. He calls out a lot of things, but I'm sure I could see him in a couple of years saying, I'm going to run for president and I'm going to be the one that's going to fix everything. RFK, all these kind of promises. There will always be another person to come along that promise that they're going to fix things. And even if that person genuinely has the best intentions and isn't a member of a secret society behind the scenes or isn't working for the Jesuits or, the Venetian black nobility, or it doesn't have any ties, like they could be the cleanest person, the system will corrupt them and they will end up selling out because you don't get into these positions of power. You definitely don't get anywhere near the presidency in the White House or being a prime minister without being groomed for that position. So this narrative that people have bought into that somehow, the Democrats never saw Trump coming and neither did the Republicans and the media, we all thought Hillary was going to win. It was just, oh my God. To me, that was all part of the operation too. It had to seem magical. It had to seem like nobody could have imagined this happen. And somehow, beyond all odds, Trump got in there. Now he's just wrecking the system. Like, I just think for me, the narrative is to not fall for politicians and to not believe that politics is going to fix our way out of this. One of my great inspirations, he's now deceased. His name was John Trudell. He was a Native American activist. And back in the 60s and the 70s, what was called the Red Power movement back then, or the American Indian movement, they were some of the last people to have literal physical gunfights with the U.S. government. And I don't think that's the solution. And then they learned very quickly that wasn't the solution. But they were the last radical natives who were pushing back against the government because of violations of treaties and things like this. And John Trudell has this really great speech where he talked about how in the 60s, he's like, we had this movement for radical ideas and people were wanting change. And then all of a sudden they started talking about voting and they started talking about going into the system. And he just basically says, like, we can't win as long as we're playing the game. The system knows how to handle us if we vote. They're just going to keep putting puppets out there for us to fall for. They know how to handle us if we choose violence. They're going to come out with their wrecking crew and their militarized police state and slam people down who think that violence is going to be the answer. And they definitely know how to deal with apathy. If we choose to just drop out and do nothing, well, they're going to just march forward with their agenda. The only thing they don't really know how to handle is if we stop playing their game and we try to build systems and solutions outside of the systems that they control. And that's a big task. It's not just go press a button once every 4 years and then somebody else is going to solve it for you. As I said earlier, that tends to involve changing your habits, changing your lifestyle, really becoming activated. And that's what I try to focus on. And I did want to mention just briefly that if people are interested in learning more about that idea of exit and build, as I call it, my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, you can download it for free. There's a free audio book. Of course, you can buy it if you like, but you can find it at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. And I also put together a free 45-day exit and build challenge. I actually did this around the election last year, kind of leading up to the election and just encouraging people, like, if you're going to vote, go ahead, that's fine. But I also encourage you to learn about this idea and do both. Learn about exit and build and getting out of unplugging from the digital systems and from the banking system and from these various systems that I call slavery systems, or that they soon will be slavery systems. And then you can still vote, but see which of these actually brings value to your life. And so if people want to check out that, that's theconsciousresistance.com/EXB, just the letters EXB, and it's completely free. It'll take you through this idea applied to your food, to your finances, to technology. And it's just like, you do one of these a week and see what comes out of it. Because this is really where I put my energy into, is trying to build alternative parallel systems. I think that is going to be the key. I don't know if it'll solve all of our problems, but I know that voting and continuing to play that game definitely isn't going to solve our problems.
Do you wake up happy? Do you wake up with purpose?
Absolutely. Every single day, man. I mean, I woke up this morning, I knew we had an interview, woke up, jumped in the shower, got ready for this. I mean, I love to do the things that I am blessed to do. I never had the idea. I didn't go to school for journalism. I didn't ever think like, okay, I'm going to become an activist and then one day I'll do interviews and, I'll write books or do this sort of stuff. It all has genuinely, as genuine as I can be, come from a place of just wanting to empower myself, educate myself, of course, but then share that knowledge with other people. And I tend to find that because I focus on solutions, that I have less time to be focused on the doom and the scrolling and all that stuff. I'm too busy creating. I'm too busy collaborating with people like you to, just get sucked into like, oh, doom and everything's screwed and everything's hopeless. And so I think there definitely is a correlation between the more action-oriented you are and the less fear you have. If you're doing nothing and you're just literally consuming podcasts and watching documentaries while you just watch the world get worse, then I'm sure that is a pretty dark place to live. But for me, if anything, I feel like this path it's given me a purpose that I don't know that I had before.
What are you listening to at the moment? Is there anything in your playlist? I've got the Lillingtons playing at the moment in my car.
Oh, nice. I'm not familiar. I'll have to check them out. So it's interesting. I still do listen to punk and metal here and there, and I don't think I've grown out of it. Although I got a little sick of some of them during COVID, watching them shill the vaccines and everything. But these days, I've also always been a punk metal vocalist. That's what I did prior to activism. I've always been in bands, and now I still make music, but I do conscious hip hop with just myself. It's kind of easier with how busy I am with everything else, just to work with a producer and make music. So what I'm listening to right now is my own music. I have a new song coming out this week that is pretty much about what we're talking about here. The chorus is, they think they can divide us, but we won't let them win. We are stronger together, more united than we've ever been. They're trying to divide us, but they can't stop the free people, because we're manifesting a future where all life is equal. So that's kind of what I'm jamming right now.
I did hear something of yours recently, but I love when you said you listen to your own music.
If I can't enjoy my own music, then I probably shouldn't be making it, right?
All right, Derrick Broze, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Hey, thank you, brother. Appreciate you.